Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 2D Twin Stick Top Down Shooter. My name is Casanis. Guys, in the last episode, we took a look at randomization of character. That might be something you want to do, it might not be, but at least now you know how to do it. In this episode, we're going to take a look at obstacles that can damage our player. All right, let's get started. Okay, guys, so before we actually begin building the asset that's going to be our obstacle, and I define obstacles as objects that are stationary, but that can still damage our player. So an obstacle is not a wall or a rock that's in your way. It's actually something that can damage the player. So there's a few things that we're going to need to do in order to be able to allow our player to get damaged. So let's take a look at the quick changes I made to the scriptable object. So I've only added in a couple of things here. I've added in a health value, so it's an int health, and I've added in a float speed. Obviously, the health value is going to be the character's health, and the speed is how fast the character can move about the game. I've added both of these into the scriptable object so that our players, or our actual classes, our character classes, can be differentiated in some way. I'm going to use the health and the speed as part of the balance for the individual classes. Okay, so as soon as you add those things, let's just move this out of the way for a second here. Once you add these things, they are immediately available inside of the scriptable objects that you've created. You do not have to go in and remake them or change them. Well, you have to change them. You have to add in the values for the things that you've added. But otherwise, everything else stays exactly the same. Nothing else has to change in here. Just go in and add the values. So that's one change that I made to this character. And obviously, we have to do something about setting the health later on and setting the speed. Okay. As well, within this character asset, I've added a couple of things. First of all, I've added in let me see if I can find it, a capsule collider right here. You can see it around the player. And the capsule collider itself is going to be used as the character's hitbox. It is a trigger, so it can pass through things, but other things will hit it, and there'll be an interaction between it and objects that can actually affect our player. So anything that can damage our player is going to be using this trigger as the hitbox for the player. Now, I put that hitbox, and it doesn't really matter where you put it. It's up to you to decide where you want it. I put that hitbox, that capsule collider, on the base layer of my player. And the reason why I did that, if I hit play right here really quickly, you'll see it looks a little bit weird here. Come on. There we go. That took some time. All right, you can see that as I move around, that capsule collider is not actually following the walk of my character. And the reason I did this is I didn't want the walk, that weird little walk that I made, to be a dodge, right? It's not about the character dodging things that are coming at it using that particular walk. So I maintained the hitbox in the same location as the base itself, so it doesn't actually move with the animation. It's up to you. You can put it wherever you want. It's perfectly fine wherever you decide to put it. I did a couple other things. First of all, I have a tag, so I've tagged the player as player, so the character as player in the tags themselves. That way, when things are checking to see if they're interacting with a particular thing in the game, it'll check the tag, and if it's player, then it affects the player, then it'll work. I also added in a new layer that I call damageable, and I'm not using this right now, but ultimately I probably will. When later on, when we're looking at layer masks and we're seeing what can affect what, we might need a damageable layer. So I created one and I added the top layer, just the player base where the collider is actually located, to the damageable layer. Okay, so I did both of those things. The last thing I did is we need some manner of actually harming the player. So I've created this thing here, this player health controller. I probably should have called it player health system so it matched the player controller system, but I didn't. I called it player health controller. So the player health controller is going to be in charge of tracking the player's health. It's a really simplistic script right now. Let's just drag it over and take a look at it. So it's a really simplistic script right now. Right here, player health controller. It's extremely simplistic right now. All it does is it has a value for the maximum health. It's the maximum health, or the health the player actually starts with. It's a value that we won't change. So we'll read in this value. It'll be set at some point. Whatever that value is, it probably won't change. We won't actually manipulate it during play. The current health is something we'll manipulate during play. So the current health is a snapshot of exactly how healthy the player is at any given time. The max health is going to allow us to say we can reset our health or gain health or whatever, and it can go back to that maximum value. So let's take a look at this code really quickly because it doesn't do a whole lot right now. What I really want it to do, I want the player to be in charge of tracking their own health. So it's not going to belong to a game system. It's not going to belong to the obstacles to track the health of the player. Each individual player character is going to track its own health. And we're going to do that right here in the player health controller. We'll need a couple of things. First of all, we'll need a way of tracking this health and reducing the health or adding health to it as we take damage or we get healed. But we'll also need a way for external objects to communicate with this particular script to damage the player. So we've added a couple things in here. First of all, we've got ourselves at the start, we set our current health and our max health to equal to each other. We adjust this later on because our health changes with this scriptable object based on what type of character you are. Now we're going to have to change this later on. So let's scrub down here and check out a couple of things. First of all, there's the set max health. And the set max health is going to read in a health value, set the max health, and the current health equal to those two values. And basically, where we do this is in the initialization of the character. We read in the character. We know what character class we are based on our initialization. And inside of the start, we go through and we set our health based on the health that we have associated with that particular scriptable object. So we find the component, we find our player health controller, and we call the public function set max health, and we set the values. That's exactly what we did here. Okay, so that's really, really easy. We also need some way of actually tracking this character's health as they take damage. Again, I've set up a public void function that's going to do just that for us. Whenever an object interacts with us and affects our health in some way, it's going to interact with this add damage, and it's going to subtract that damage that's done from our current health. The only other thing this does right now is it examines our current health to see if it's less than or equal to 0. And if it is, it just prints player dead. Obviously, we're going to have to adjust this. This is going to be something much, much bigger later on. We're going to have to add, what happens if we die, turn off all the controls, have a death animation, whatever it is you want to do is going to happen within here. But just for the time being, we're going to leave it really, really simplistic like this so that we can see that we're interacting with objects, that we're taking damage, and when we die. And that's it. There's actually nothing else in this script right now. So those are the changes that we made to the player character. There was one more, and let's just take a quick look at it. As I mentioned here, we find the component, the player health, and we set the health with a public function. We do exactly the same thing with the player speed. In this case, we are looking for the player controller, the player control system, and we set the base speed. We didn't have this function before. Let's find it in here. Here it is right here. All we do in exactly the same way, we have a public function that we can access from external. In this particular case, it's internal to the character still. And we set the character's base speed. So each character will move at a different rate based on the character type that they are. Okay, that's it. That's all the changes we made to the actual player character. Let's take a look at building one of our obstacles. You'll note that in building this asset, it's done in a very, very similar manner to how we did our player. And later on, when we build our enemies, it's going to be done in exactly the same way. So I started off with something that I called spike base. And the spike base itself is simply it still says player base. Let's click on this. The spike base itself is simply an object that I use to place this asset in the world. That's really what it comes down to. I can add other things to it if I want to. So let's say I wanted the player not to be able to walk through this particular asset, then I would probably put a collider in this location. Things like that. But otherwise, the spike base or the base of whatever asset you're building is really just about placing the object in the world and acting as an origin for the remainder of our assets, the remainder of our hierarchy. Later on, when we want to animate something, if we're animating the transform location, the position of an object, it's going to be based on the spike base or whatever it is above it in the hierarchy. So this moves the animation out of world space and puts it into the space of this local space of the spike base. That's what it's for. Same thing as a player. This is nothing new. We already talked about this. Below spike base, I have spike art. Player art, spike art, exactly the same thing. And my spike art is literally where I put my art. That's all it is, just where I put my art. So if I take a look at spike art right here, there's nothing associated with it. If I look at spike trap, this is just renderers. That's all it is. So if I open it up, I've got myself the spike. which is this thing, and I have myself my base spike. It's just the art. I created it in Photoshop, I dragged it in here, and now I can use it to animate or whatever I want to do. So that's what this spike art is. Below that, we have our aim base. And guess what? Exactly the same way with our player, we had an aim base. It does exactly the same thing. The aim base basically tells the system where it's aiming. So I've got this arrow kind of associated with it the same way I did with the player. That is just a visual for you. Later on, I'm going to turn that off. We don't want to see it anymore. It's just to make sure that we understand which direction our asset is pointed in the world. The aim base is exactly the same thing it does for the player. It aims at something. If we want to control it, we absolutely can. If we don't want to control it and we want to set it, we can do that too. So if I always wanted this asset to damage in this direction, I'm going to use my aim base pointed in that direction to make sure that my projectile is produced over here. That's it. That's exactly how this works. Below that is the interesting object, and this is what makes this into an obstacle. This is what makes this into something that can actually damage our player. So this is kind of a really important one, the damage zone. So the damage zone itself is basically in charge of interacting with the player. That's what its job is. It consists of a collider that's set up as a trigger, and as a player walks into that trigger area, it tells this object that, hey, there's a player here. It doesn't do anything other than that. It just says, hey, we are now interacting with a player. We're going to use projectiles to actually interact or do damage or do something to the player. The damage zone is just in charge of saying it's here, the player is here, and then setting up or instantiating that actual projectile to do something. So I've got the collider here. That's part of it. The other big part is the enemy combat system. And the enemy combat system is going to be added. In fact, the damage zone is going to be added into every single thing that we want to interact with our player. I called it damage zone, but maybe I should have called it the interaction zone, because if we really wanted to create a healing fountain, well, we could do that too. Basically, the way it works is as a character walks through the trigger, it tells the system, hey, there's something here, and then it instantiates a projectile. That projectile is in charge of interacting with the player, doing damage or healing or giving a speed boost or whatever you want. If I want to make a speed fountain, I would just change out this projectile. So the projectile is a standalone game object that, again, is going to include some form of interaction with the player, so some type of trigger, and then it's going to do something to the player. All right, it's a completely standalone object. The cool thing is I can take this damage zone, I can put it on anything I want. I can change the global variables here, the public variables here, so the attack rate, the damage rate, etc. I can change these things, and I can instantly change it into be something else. I can make a moving projectile, I could make a stationary projectile, I could make whatever I want just by changing out this value here, this projectile object. So it's really, really, really flexible. That's what's really good about this system. Let's take a look at the code behind the enemy combat system. So there's a fair amount of stuff that's actually happening here in the enemy combat system. I tried to make it robust enough to allow for certain things to happen. Like if I decide to make this into a local multiplayer game, I tried to make it robust enough to work for any situation. And that's one of the problems with what I'm doing here, guys. I'm developing this game without a design, and that's not how you make games. I should have sat down, I should have worked out exactly what this game is, I should have understood what I was going to have in it, and then designed it appropriately. I don't actually have that design plan, so some of the things I'm doing might actually be unnecessary, but I'm setting up for the future. All right, so let's take a look at the enemy combat system. I tackle a few ideas in here that are new. It's not very lengthy. There's not a lot of code here, but it's a slightly more complex system. So let's take a look at what we've got here. I've got this bool, whether something is a triggered attack or not. So the way I thought about this is, in some situations, we may wish for our player to walk into something and then trigger it and then take damage. Or we may wish for, I don't know, something just to be continuously shooting or continuously going off, and if the player then walks into it, it just automatically damages them. So there's a couple of different choices, and basically it comes down to whether or not the player has to interact with the asset first, and then they are attacked, or if it's just consistently attacking. That's what this particular bool does. If it has to be triggered, then there's a collider, a trigger they'll walk through, and they will interact with the object. Okay, so that's set to true. That's what happens. If it's false, then it won't. Below that is our attack rate, and the attack rate is how quickly something will attack. It is how often, I should say, how often something will attack. If it has an attack rate of 1, it will attack once every second. Below that is damage. How much damage does this particular asset do? I decoupled this idea from the actual projectile. I feed that value into the projectile later on when we instantiate it. I say do this much damage, but it's unnecessary. I didn't want to have it on the projectile. I decoupled it from the projectile so the projectile can be used anywhere I want, and the damage then can be assigned based on the asset that it's associated with. Below that is an attacking and an attack ready value. Both of these are bools. And they basically just tell us if this object is ready to do damage to the player, or if it's even already attacking, if it's already actually doing damage. Um, so yeah, this is what these two are. We'll take a look at exactly how they work in just a moment. Below that, we have a game object called Projectile. And the projectile itself, as I've already mentioned, is what interacts with the player. And so the projectile could be anything you want. We can swap it in, swap it out, and change how this particular asset works. Below that is a reference to something called the attack temp. The attack temp is going to be a reference to the projectile when we instantiate it, and then we can adjust values on the actual projectile. Below that is a reference to an animator. So if there's animation associated with this, then we're going to want to play the animation. Below that is a reference to an audio source. Again, if there's sounds, we want to play it. If there's sounds, then we've got them here as well. So I've got an array of sounds here so that we don't have the same sound over and over and over again. We have like whoosh, whoosh, whoosh whenever the same whoosh whenever the player walks over the spike, for example. Below that, now this is something that I added thinking that maybe I'd make this into a local multiplayer later on. It is a list of game objects, and that list is generated whenever a character walks into the trigger area. That way, normally if you were interacting with an object and you walked away from it, if you were playing a game by yourself, a solo game, you walked into a trigger area, something happens, and you walk out of it, something stops happening. In the case of local multiplayer, if one player walks in and then a second player walks in and then the other player walks out, well, there's still one player that's actually in the area interacting with that object. So I don't want the interactions to actually stop unless there are no players interacting. That's what that's for. And again, I don't know if this is going to be multiplayer or not. I'm just thinking ahead. This is a reference to the collider. So there's going to be a collider associated with every single one of these objects, the trigger area, and whether we use it or not is going to be determined. But each one will actually have a collider. If we don't need it, we'll turn it off. Below that is the aim controller, a transform aim controller. This is going to determine which direction our projectile will be instantiated in. And that is just the aim base that we looked at on the actual asset. Below that is a reference to a vector. So what direction is the aim controller facing? It's facing an aim direction. And below that, now this is kind of an interesting one. This is an attack damage controller. We haven't talked about this yet. It's right here. And this is going to be added to each of our projectiles. So whenever a character interacts with the projectile, it's going to go into the attack damage controller to find out exactly what happens. So this is going to be a reference to the attack damage controller that is produced on our projectile. So it's going to build the projectile, grab a reference to the projectile's attack damage controller, and then make adjustments to the actual projectile. Okay, here we've got our start function, and all we do in here is, as you can see, we find a reference to the different things we need, to the animator, to the audio source, to the actual collider as well. Below that is an if statement. This if statement determines whether or not this is a triggered object. If it's not a triggered object, so it's just continuously firing, we want to skip everything to do with the actual collider, everything to do with the actual interaction that occurs with the character in the collider, and instead just start our attacking. Now, this is something new for a lot of you. Start coroutine attack. Let's take a look at exactly what it does. So it'll take this format for certain. It'll say start coroutine, and then you'll apply some function to that routine that you wish to start. Let's take a look at our attack. I'm going to scrub down here and find our attack, and it's right here. IEnumerator attack. So this is the function itself. It has to have the IEnumerator keyword in order to be a coroutine. And right here in this very, very first line, we can see where calling the attack will cause this system to yield. It'll cause the system to stop until something happens. So yield return new wait for seconds. The wait for seconds says don't do anything for X amount of time and then return and continue. So it won't actually do anything down here until this wait 4 seconds is done. In this particular case, we wait for attack rate amount of time before we continue on. This is going to do a couple of things. This is going to allow me to this is going to allow a pause as the player interacts with an object or as an enemy goes to attack. There's going to be a pause before the actual attack happens. At that time, we might want to have some kind of anticipatory animation that occurs. Something like that might happen. So this wait 4 seconds says wait for the amount of time before you actually attack, and it's going to wait for the attack rate. So if I have an attack rate of 1, it's going to wait 1 second, and then it's going to go on and actually perform the attack. So let's take a look at what the attack actually is. The first thing we do is we instantiate the projectile, because remember, that's exactly how we actually attack the player. The projectile is how we interact with the player. So we instantiate the projectile, and we take a reference to that instantiated object in the attack temp. Afterwards, we go ahead and we find the attack damage controller, and we store it in the attack damage controller. Afterwards, we set the damage of the projectile. The damage itself is associated with the object, so we tell the projectile this is how much damage you're going to do. We'll take a look at that in 1 second. After that, we check to see whether or not this thing should be aimed. If it should be aimed, we're going to aim it in that particular direction. So if the aim controller is equal to null, then we just set it to 0. So if for some reason they haven't set the aim controller, we handle that situation. We just set it to the 0, 0, 0, which means it's going to be associated with the particular vector. The 0 vector is going to be instantiated right there. Okay, otherwise, we find the aim controller and we find its transform.up. So when we have the transform.up, we put that in the aim direction. That means we're going to be instantiating the object, this particular object. We're going to instantiate it or aim it in that particular direction along the transform.up. So it's going to rotate around the transform.up. Exactly the same way we did the rotation of the aim object for our player. It's identical in nature. Nothing else has changed. After that, we set the direction of the controller. So inside of the attack damage controller, we do that again. We'll take a look at that in 1 second. Afterwards, if there's animation of any kind, we set the attack value for a trigger. So I'm going to make the assumption that any animation we've added is going to have a single trigger. So later on when we have animation of a character swinging or whatever, we're going to use a simple trigger to say, do your attack now. And it's going to go into the animator and set that parameter, and then we're going to do the attack animation. So if there's an animator, then go ahead and set the attack value. Below that, we have the sound that we create. So if there's like a whoosh sound or a fireball sound or whatever, we are going to create that sound here. We do it as a one shot. So if this thing gets removed from play for some reason or whatever, at least the sound continues on. And again, all we've done is found a random sound from our array, and we've played that sound. Below that is something interesting that we haven't looked at all. So yes, we've already looked at coroutines, but we haven't looked at recursion. So this attack calls itself. So the attack will call another attack, will call another attack, as long as we remain attacking and not ready to attack. Okay, so if we're already attacking, but we're not actually attacking, that's what this not ready yet attack means. We're not actually attacking, then go ahead and perform another attack. So this is called recursion. It's when a function can call itself over and over and over again. And it's a very, very powerful tool. So let's scrub back up here because we ended off right here on the start where we actually started this coroutine. So if there's no trigger required and this automatically starts to attack, then we turn off the collider, we set up the attacking to be true, we set up attack ready to be false, and we start our attack. And it will continue because there's nothing that's going to stop it now. So it'll just keep going over and over and over again. Okay, let's take a look at what happens on trigger enter and on trigger exit, because if we're actually interacting with this object, if it's actually a triggered object, as the player comes in, something has to happen. Well, we check to see if it's the player. Great. If it is, we add that to our contact list so we know how many players we have that are currently in contact with this particular object. After that, if we're not attacking and we are ready to attack, well, then we set our attacking to be true and our ready to attack to be false, and we start our coroutine. So it goes through that exact same situation that we just described. It calls attack and it starts attacking. Okay, what happens when a character leaves? Well, if the character leaves, so we check to see, is it a player that's leaving our collider? If it is, then we remove that player from the contact list. Okay, so if there's no more people in the contact list, so all the things are empty, then we're going to do something. However, if there's still players that are there, still characters that are within that range, then we're going to just keep going as if nothing's happened. So if our count is less than or equal to 0, I've got the less than there just in case there's some error, but equal to 0 is probably fine. Then we would turn off our collider and we start our cooldown routine. And it's exactly the same thing. We start coroutine, we call a function. In this particular case, it is the cooldown function. All the cooldown function does is it sets our attacking equal to false. It waits for an attack rate amount of time before we set everything to be back again. So we get ready to attack again and we enable our collider again. The reason why we've got this cooldown in place, it's going to prevent our players from dodging in and out. Theoretically, there could be an error that's created if the player is moving in and out very quickly of the trigger. And I wanted to avoid that. I don't know if it's necessary to have this, and this actually sets up a delay before each attack or after each attack. So if you've attacked and then you leave the trigger area, there's actually an attack rate amount of time where you can kind of go back in and not interact with this object at all because the collider itself has been shut off. So that's it. So as a player leaves, if they're the last player, we go into this cooldown, and after the cooldown's over, everything gets reset and we're ready to fight again. Okay, so that is the enemy combat system. One last thing we should look at is the attack damage controller. So the attack damage controller, the job of the attack damage controller is basically to interact with the player. That's what it is. We have a public reference to a rigid body. We have a public reference to a collider. I'm assuming that each one will have a rigid body and each one have a collider. If not, we'll have to handle that. The collider is going to be necessary to allow interaction with whatever it touches. So the collider is going to be there no matter what. It doesn't necessarily have to have a rigid body, but it might. And so if we want to move this along, let's say we have a fireball that we want to shoot out, then we're going to have a rigid body in order to move it. Okay, below that we have our damage. So this is the damage that's going to happen whenever the player interacts with it. And we have a speed that's associated with this as well. If this is a moving object, we're going to have set the velocity. We're going to have to, set the velocity in some way. Below that is a public bool, destroy on contact. And destroy on contact means that once we interact with the player, we want to destroy this object. I actually don't know if I wrote code for that. Did I? I didn't. So I'll have to write the code for that. I'll just tell you what it is for now, and I'll write the code afterwards. So the destroy on contact means that if this object enters, it's going to happen in here. If this object enters into space of a player, we want to actually destroy it. So if we don't do that, this object theoretically could continue along and hit multiple players. So let's say I made a fireball, and that fireball shot off, and it hit player 1, and I want to explode. Awesome. If it doesn't destroy on contact, it'll go through player 1 and possibly hit player 2, etc. So that's what that's supposed to be for. We're just going to add that in here on the on trigger. Okay, so what do? We check to see if we have a rigid body. We actually haven't checked to see if there's one or not. We probably should, because if there's not one, this is going to come back as null, and if we're using it, I do check it down here. If it's null and we try and use it, then obviously we'll be in some trouble. So we find the rigid body, assuming that it's on the same layer as this script is, so in the same hierarchical layer as the script. We had a couple of public functions. So here's our set projectile. The set projectile we call from our enemy combat, and it just sets the damage. So it says this is how much damage you're going to do, and that's how we set it up. Below that is another public function, set direction. We call that as well from the enemy combat system, and all it does is it sets a velocity of an object in a particular direction if there is a rigid body. Now the velocity might be 0. If there's no rigid body, if there is a rigid body and there's no velocity, the velocity is 0, it'll just put it in place. It'll multiply this times 0, and it'll just put it right at the origin of the object that instantiates it. So that's basically how this works. Above that is our on trigger enter, and our on trigger enter is what the reaction is, or what's happening whenever this object comes in contact with the player. So we check the player, check to see if it is a player. So we check the tag. If the tag is equal to player, then we are looking for the player health controller, and we add damage. And that's it. That's all that we have to do in order to have these objects work. That was a lot. I admit that was a lot, but that's all we have to do to create any kind of obstacle we want at all. So let's take a look at exactly how these things work. Let's start off by taking a look at the spike base. I'm just going to turn off this turret for now so we didn't interact with it. Let's take a look at how the spike itself works. Again, the spike itself is going to instantiate an object. If I go on to damage zone and I scrub down, it's going to instantiate the projectile center attack. And if we go to our project and we go to our prefabs and we double click on our projectile center attack, it basically consists of this object right here. So it's got a collider associated with it. You know, I'm thinking about this now. I don't know if I actually need this mic collider. I can probably get rid of that. I don't think I need it. I don't actually have a rigid body associated with this at all. It's not actually moving. All that's going to happen is this object is going to be instantiated around this spike. And if the player is in contact with this trigger, then they're going to take their damage. Okay, so damage is currently set to 0. Speed is set to 0. Speed is going to remain 0 because I don't actually want this thing moving in any way. The damage is going to be set by the calling object, which is this object, which is our spike object. And that's it. That's all that's here. Let's go back to the scene for 1 second. Let's take a look at our damage zone. And our damage zone says that this will attack once every second, and it will do 10 damage. And it has got 3 different whoosh sounds associated with it. Okay, so I'm going to hit play. And this is going to take forever. Again, I don't know why it's taking so long now, but let's... come on. You can do this. There we go. Okay, so I've got my character up here. Let's click on here for a second so we can see. I don't know what this error is. I'm getting it now. Graphics, Edge, Wake Up. I'll have to look it up. So I've generated a fighter character. He has 40 health. Okay, so this object does 10 damage. Now, if I run across quickly, you can see that it just kicked off. So I kicked off that thing, and I didn't actually take any damage because I was out of the way. That's how it's set up. So the spikes are set up so that you can run across, and they go off afterwards. But if you stop on the spikes, they start to whack you, and you can see I'm taking 10 damage at a time until I am dead. Nothing else happens right now because nothing happens in the I am dead function. But later on, we're going to have to set it up so that this guy here is dead after we move on. Okay, so that's how the spikes work. And again, it's just simply a projectile that I create whenever I go through the trigger. Okay, pretty simplistic, and it works really, really well. Now, what's the difference between the spike and this turret? Well, let me turn off the spike, and we'll take a look now at the turret. So let me just pull back a little bit here so we can actually see the turret. So here it is over here. If I hit play, come on. I'll have to check and see what's happening here. If I hit play, okay, look at the arrow. That is pointing directly at our player no matter which way we go. This thing worked in exactly the same way. If I click on my turret, all right, I can see my collider. This guy has 30 health. The turret actually does, if I open this up and I take a look at my damage zone, it's set up to fire every 2 seconds and it'll do 1 damage. So if I run around out here all day, nothing will happen until I walk into the trigger area. After 2 seconds, it'll start to fire off its projectile. All right, and now that I'm outside, it won't fire anymore. And if I walk in here, as long as I'm staying within, it will continue to fire its projectile. Okay, and you can see that it's following me along. Now, obviously, oh, I got hit. I was about to make fun of that. Obviously, if you want it to be faster, you wanted this to be more of a challenge to your player, you could increase the speed at which that projectile is moving. It's exactly the same as the spike. It works exactly the same way. The only difference is, in this particular case, I'm looking at the direction that the arrow is pointing, and that's my aim base. It's looking at my aim base, and it's saying, point the projectile in that direction. Let's take a look at that projectile really quickly. If I go back to my project and I double click on this one, I've got myself my projectile. I've got myself a fireball and a circle. So it's just a particle system and a circle. The projectile base, what does it have? It's got itself a rigid body. Awesome. It's got itself attack damage, and I've got the attack damage set up here. It'll overwrite it. So you saw that I was only doing 1 damage. In this particular case, I set it to be 10. It will overwrite that. It has a speed of 5. And that's all it's doing. It's being destroyed after 5 seconds. So it goes in and it uses exactly the same attack damage script that we already looked at. Exactly the same thing. Nothing different here. The only difference between this object, our actual turret object, is the fact that on our aim, so if we go to our aim base, is it on our aim base? No, sorry, it's on our turret base. On our turret base, I have put an extra function extra script that's called enemy aim controller script. Let's just drag it over really quick and have a quick look at it. The enemy aim controller script, all it does is it takes, and this has to change, it takes the transform target, it takes the aim base, which we've already set up, and all it does is it continuously points at the difference between those. So it calculates the target, it calculates its transform position, subtracts those values to get an aim direction, and then afterwards it aims in that direction. The target is the player. Now, this only works because this is a single player game right now. Later on, I would have to write in here functionality inside of the enemy aim controller. I'd have to create the functionality to choose the closest enemy and aim at the closest enemy. But that's relatively simplistic, and we can take a look at that in a later video. Okay, a couple really fast things that I want to take a look at just before we finish up. What if we didn't actually want this object to be aimed? All right, so let's go in here. We're going to turn off on our base. We're going to turn off our enemy aim controller. So this is not there. I'll just pretend it's not there. And we're still going to use our enemy aim. So our turret aim. Here's our aim base. Let's say we wanted aiming in, let's put this at -90. Let's say we wanted aiming in this direction. Okay, so it's no longer going to aim at our player, but it's going to fire off in that direction. Now, the other thing that we can take a look at is whether or not this is a triggered, not there, whether or not this is a triggered attack. All right, if I turn off is triggered attack and I hit play now and I wait an eternity for Unity to kick in. Here we go. We can do it. All right. There we go. So now it's just going to automatically fire every 2 seconds without stopping. So if you want to make some kind of game where you had to dodge between these things to move along or whatever, you could do so. Okay. So the functionality is there regardless of the type of turret or the type of obstacle that you want to create. All of the functionality is there for you. All right, guys, that's what I wanted to cover in this episode. I really hope you did enjoy it. If you did, let me know down below with a thumbs up. If you didn't, thumbs down. That's fine. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. I know I screwed up a ton of stuff in this video, and I apologize. Anyway, guys, thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.